Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm going to be reviewing the new album from Daron Malakian and the Scars on Broadway, Dictator. This is the second album released by this group, fronted by Daron Malakian, and I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly because I'm awful with names. But this is the second album from this group, the first under this new name. Previously it was just Scars on Broadway, now it's Daron Malakian and the Scars on Broadway. Really not much of a difference, but it's worth mentioning, I guess. And this project kind of came out of the ashes of the end of System of a Down, one of the most popular and most critically praised groups of the alternative metal and nu metal era, the late 90s, early 2000s, that whole scene. Typically not all too liked for the most part, except for some certain bands, System of a Down being one of those, and really liked in some regards. I think that they're a great band. And coming out of the end of that group, really, the first Scars on Broadway album came out, and now we get this follow-up like 10 years later, though actually this album was made and recorded back in 2012, but we're just getting it now in 2018, so it's a little confusing, but not really all that confusing, really, when you think about it. And I believe the reason behind this sort of complicated history with this album, at least according to what I saw on Wikipedia, and it's Wikipedia, so maybe it's not all that true, but apparently it was recorded, and Daron was a little, skeptical about putting it out because, he wasn't sure if new System material was going to happen in the future. I know that they've been doing some live shows recently. Some people have been speculating some new material from this group, but, it hasn't really happened yet, and Daron just wanted to get this material out there, I guess to, satisfy some fans looking for some System-related material. So, they're getting it in the form of this album here, which, in terms of the sound of this thing, is not all too far off from the sound System had in their albums, or the sound that was present on the first album from this group. It's still that similar alternative metal type sound. Of course, it is different from System of a Down, but still in the same vein, and does have some similar tendencies to it. More on that later, but pretty much he just wanted to get this out there into the world, given that lots of people have, been, wanting new System of a Down material for a while now. And this also does kind of make me think that we're not getting any new material from them in the near future, at least, given that, if we were getting new material from them in the near future, this wouldn't have been put out, maybe? I don't know, but back to Dictator, this new project here, or maybe not so new project given when it was recorded. I went into this thing expecting it to be good, I expected to enjoy it, but honestly I didn't go into it expecting it to be all that special or all that great, given that it was, recorded years ago, just being released now, kind of just to tide fans over, I feel. But honestly, listening to this album all the way through multiple times, and I have to say that I really enjoy this record, like even more than I was expecting to. And I don't feel like this was just a project to put out there just to keep fans happy. I mean, I feel like in part that's what it was trying to do, but I think that there's definitely a lot of quality material on this thing to keep fans happy, not just, to keep them happy till the next project, but rather there's enough material on here that's really good to keep fans just happy in general. Like, this isn't just some appetizer for a possible System of a Down album coming, down the line. This is a fully fledged, very enjoyable product through and through. Like I mentioned before, the sound of this project is pretty much what you would probably expect. It has this sort of System of a Down feel, but also that first Scars on Broadway album feel as well. Daron Malakian's guitar playing, it just has that sort of unique sound to it. That he just always has, regardless of what track he's on, that instantly lets you know that he's the one playing guitar on the track. That's why I think many System fans are going to like this project, given that he does have that very signature guitar sound just throughout this thing. And his vocals on this thing also sound very nice. Of course, I loved it in System of a Down when he was, harmonizing vocals. I love when bands just have multiple vocalists going at once. And here, of course, is just one vocalist, but he still has a great voice, I think, and it sounds nice on here as well. I think if you like the sound of, previous projects similar to this one, you're gonna like this one as well, just at least to some extent, I feel. This album has one of the strongest first halves of any first half of an album that I've heard in 2018. Really, track after track in this first half is just fire song after fire song, pretty much. They're all really hits, I feel. It starts off with the track Lives, which is the lead single from this project. I heard it prior to hearing this album, and I thought it was a pretty solid song, but hearing it in the context of this record makes it even better, I feel. It just has a very, it has that more typical feel, I guess you could say. It doesn't experiment all too much. And that's one thing that you could say for many of the tracks on this album. They're not super experimental, really. You pretty much know what you're going to get going into it, and that's what you're delivered. However, it delivers it in a way that's, it's doing something pretty standard, but it's excelling at it. So it doesn't really need to, experiment a whole ton, I feel. It just does what it does, and it does it very well. And this first track, Lives, I think is a good example of that. It has a catchy hook, great guitar parts. It's overall just a very solid song and a great opening to this album. Then you have the following two tracks, Angry Guru and Dictator, two, angry, aggressive, very in-your-face songs, but they're also just incredibly catchy and just have a very standout feel to them. And one thing I've always liked about System of a Down and, kind of the Scars on Broadway side project thing, I guess you could say, that kind of came out of the ashes of that band, is that, it manages to do the whole alternative metal, sort of new metal thing in a way that is very well done. It has, those heavier sounds to it, but also keeps some of those poppier tendencies, like the very catchy choruses, and it does it very well. It does it without a lot of the bad things that lots of bands of that time period did. This album is just a very solid album from this genre, is what I'm trying to get at. And, while this album does deliver, three very solid tracks in a row that are, stylistically pretty similar, very aggressive to some extent, very up in your face at the start of this project, it starts to get a bit more interesting after these first three tracks as we get the, get a bit more diverse with what kind of tracks were being delivered. The fourth and fifth tracks on this album start to maybe slow things down a bit more, but they still do pack a punch. They have very catchy choruses to them, and just manage to be very standout tracks in their own right. Definitely a bit different from the first three, but very interesting on their own. And then the sixth track on here, I do like the kind of lyrical shift on here. Many of the songs on this album are a bit political to some extent. That shouldn't be surprising to anyone who's a fan of System of a Down. But this track here starts to, it kind of is talking about, I guess, someone that Daron knew, or maybe it's just a story he's telling, maybe it's not based on a true story or anything like that. But essentially the narrator, someone they knew, and they're just kind of growing apart from them due to just bad things happening between them. Kind of a typical story, I guess you could say, but still a very solid song overall. And another thing about this song that I like is that it's once again a more just in-your-face, to-the-point type song like the first three on the album, changing things up once again from the two tracks that preceded it. Like I mentioned before, the first half of this album is one of the best first halves of an album I've heard in 2018 so far. I just think it's a really just near flawless, really, because just every track after track is just fantastic, at least in my opinion. I do have some minor gripes with it that I'll get to later on when I just talk about some of the complaints I have with this album. But really, these 6 songs are incredibly enjoyable. They flow together very nicely, have some great hooks in them, great guitar parts. They're all just really solid. The second half of this album I do also like, but I do think it is the weaker half of the two halves of this project. But still, like with each listen of this album, I grew to like the second half more and more with each listen. It's definitely a bit less in your face, a bit less memorable on first listen, but it's still, it has elements to it that stick with you more on repeated listens, at least I feel. Before I get into maybe some of my, more mixed opinions, I do want to try to talk about the track Sickening Wars that appears on the second half of this album, which was one, my favorite of the second half tracks on here, because it's just this very aggressive, very in-your-face song, almost punk-like in a way. I love the hook on this track. It's so catchy, so aggressive. You just want to shout along to it every time it comes on. It's a fantastic song all around. Some of the tracks on the second half of this album do, branch out and experiment a bit more than some of the songs from the first disc. Like you have the track Till the End, which is kind of this slower, more ballad-like track. I'm not quite sure I would say it's a ballad, but it's closest to anything on this album gets to being one. It's probably my least favorite song in the entire album, just because it's the only one that doesn't really have a kind of more aggressive feel, I guess you could say. I don't know, it just didn't click with me as much compared to some of the other songs on here. Not a bad song by any means, but it's just my least favorite overall. You also have the instrumental track on here, which is a cover song entitled, I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong. It's like Mo, which is my son. I'm not sure what language that is in, and I probably butchered it really badly, and I apologize for that. And I forgot the artist that it's covering, but it's this instrumental track that I think sounds very nice. It's a nice change of pace in this album, especially towards the end of this thing. And you know, an instrumental track is always a nice way to switch things up on an album. And I do think while many instrumental tracks on albums end up feeling just like filler or just fluff to add to the runtime, this one is pretty solid overall. I don't think it's one of the best tracks, but it still adds to the album, I think. And the closing track on here is also a cover track, Assimilate, which is a cover of, if I'm not mistaken, the band is like, it's like Skinny Puppy or something along those lines. I'm not familiar with the group or their version of this song, the original version, so I just went into this thing, you know, without knowing any of that. And the song is pretty solid in my opinion. I think it definitely matches the aggressive attitude of many of the other tracks on this album. You could definitely notice a shift in, you know, the lyrics here. Of course, given that they were, you know, they're covering another band here, so the lyric style is pretty different. Considering that much of the other tracks on this album just have a very straightforward approach to their lyrics. And this is something that could be, you know, a good thing at times, and at times does leave a little bit to be desired, I feel. In some ways, it makes some of these political messages on the album and just some of the other messages on here very straightforward, easy to understand, especially when you pair that up with the very straightforward and aggressive feel of many of these tracks. It makes for, you know, it just works overall. I don't think it needs to be super complicated at times for it to work. Though at times there are some tracks on here, at least, that leave me maybe wanting a little bit more from the lyrics. Like at times maybe it's just a little bit too straightforward. Like, you know, you'll hear the song the first time through and you pretty much could take in everything the lyrics are trying to tell you on that first listen, because there's not really all that much, you know, much more depth than what you're going to get out of a first listen. It's not to say that the songs here aren't deep or don't have meanings to them. They certainly do, but they just present them in a very straightforward, on-the-nose manner, which for the most part does work on here. And it's something that, you know, when I first listened to the album, it was a bigger complaint that I had, but as I listened to this thing over and over again, especially given how sticky some of these hooks are, I do think some of the more straightforward lyrics do end up working to this album's benefit, just because they do get stuck in your head so easily and make you want to sing along whenever one of these big choruses comes on here on this album. But yeah, back to Assimilate. I know I got a little off topic there, but this track, you know, the lyrical style shifts a little bit. It still is pretty aggressive, but it's clearly not the same as the rest of the album, which, you know, you would expect given it's a cover song. It does stand out a little bit, but, you know, that's really more of a nitpick than any big complaint that I have with this project. So overall, I feel like this album is a very solid project. Like, I feel like it's kind of like on the edge between being a very good album and a great album, but it just barely makes over the line into being great territory. Like, I really enjoy listening to this thing through. Like I said, the first half of this thing is one of the most solid first halves of an album I've heard this year, with the only real gripes I have with this first half being maybe some of the lyrics being a bit too, you know, straightforward at times, not having a lot more to really dive into. That's really all I could say in terms of complaints with the first half. And then the second half, there are some tracks that I don't care quite as much for in the second half, but I do think, you know, even the weakest tracks in the second half here are very, you know, enjoyable, very solid tracks. They're not bad songs by any means, and they're definitely not really filler tracks either, because each track on here does serve a different purpose than the other. Overall, if you're a fan of Scars on Broadway, if you're a fan of System of a Down, and you're just, you know, you've been waiting for new material, hoping for new material, and, you know, you just want new material, I highly recommend you give this album a listen if you haven't done so already, because, of course, this isn't new System of a Down material. In fact, it's not even new material, technically, but it still is very great material that has a very similar vibe to System of a Down, given, you know, the vocalist and guitarist are the same, or at least one of the vocalists. If you're a fan of System of a Down, if you're a fan of the last Scars on Broadway album, I think you're going to like this project. I think you're going to really enjoy it. And there's just so many great songs on this thing that I could see myself coming back to in the future. And, you know, that's saying something, considering I went into this thing expecting to like it, but not quite expecting to like it as much as I did. I expected this to be a decent project, really, but not really a great one. But I ended up getting a project that was overall really enjoyable through and through. And this album definitely doesn't overstay its welcome either. It's just around 40 minutes in length. You know, given that most of the tracks on here are pretty short, pretty to the point, it ends up being a rather fast listen, at least in my own opinion. The album breezes by, but it leaves me wanting to listen to it again, but not in the way that it didn't deliver enough the first time around. It's overall just a really solid project, in my opinion. One that if you're an alternative metal fan, if you were a fan of that sound back when it was really popular, you've been craving for more System of a Down or bands similar to that, give this album a listen. It's worth your time. It definitely wasn't something that was just dropped the tide fans over before the new System of a Down album that may or may not be happening, because this right here is very good quality material. I definitely recommend it. But yeah, with that said, this is my own personal opinion on this album. Feel free to have your own. Feel free to like it more than I do, dislike it more than I do. Anything really. In fact, feel free to leave your own opinion in the comment section down below. I greatly appreciate seeing it, starting up some conversations down there. That would be greatly appreciated. And while you're down there, also make sure to leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content. Album reviews, track reviews, countdown lists, discussions, things of that sort. I definitely will review a new System of a Down album if it ever gets released. I assure you that. So if you're curious to see that, subscribe, and maybe someday I'll do it, because, you know, as of right now, I don't know if that's ever going to happen at this point, especially given that we got this instead. But, you know, I'm content with getting this. This was just as solid a project as I think a new System album could have been, and I'm pretty happy about that. So thanks for watching, guys, and stay golden.